First and foremost, let me introduce you to our lecturer today. His name is Dr. Jonathan Crane. He's from the UF IFAS office. He's a tropical fruit specialist, and we're really excited to have him talk today about mangoes in your landscape. So without further ado, let's give it up for Jonathan Crane.
Thanks very much, Amy. Thank you. And thanks for inviting me. So we're going to talk a little bit about growing mangoes in the home landscape. And let's go. Okay, just a little bit of mango production information. That's a graph there showing the acres of mangoes in Florida, and along the bottom of the graph is the year, 1965, all the way to 2022, right? And so this is data from the United States Department of Agriculture on how many commercial acreage there is of mangoes in Florida. And so, let me just see. Oops, great. Okay, so you'll notice that the acreage was quite high, up around 3,000 acres back in the early 90s, and then dropped off rapidly. So in 1992, the acreage dropped dramatically because of Hurricane Andrew. It took out about half the acreage. And then in 1994, we had a free trade agreement called NAFTA. And so the Florida industry really could not compete with the varieties that we were growing at the time, and so the acreage declined quite a bit. But in the past 5 years, the acreage has increased dramatically. And there's some reasons for that, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Over on the other side, you'll see those orange dots. That's where the USDA has said there's at least 1 acre of commercial mango production in Florida. You see some up in the Panhandle. Well, I'm not so sure those are still there, but they were there at least right before the survey, right? But the other main top counties, and you'll see Lee County has about 1,500 acres of commercial production. Miami-Dade, about 1,000, Palm Beach, about 320. And so you can see it's along a lot of it's along the coast and in South Florida, right? This is just a picture here is in Homestead, this is in West Palm Beach, and then this is on Pine Island. Those are the 3 main production areas in Florida. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about environmental conditions. So historically, there's a reason why mango production is not throughout central Florida. In fact, people have been trying to grow mangoes in Florida since the 1800s, and they started basically from Polk County south. But freezing weather and freezing events killed the plants, right? So that's the reason you have production in West Palm Beach, Lee County, and Miami-Dade. It's because of continuous freezing events killed the plants for the most part in most places. So there are optimum growing temperatures for mangoes, and so that ranges between about 75 and 86 degrees is the perfect temperature range for growing mangoes. However, if your mature trees are exposed to about 25 degrees or less, then you start to have damage, and if it's long enough or it gets even colder than that, then the trees can be damaged or killed, especially young trees. Young trees can only really go down to about 27, 28 degrees for any period of time. Heat damage, and so we're starting to see a little bit more heat damage in the past couple of years. Mostly it has to do with sunburn of the fruit, so the fruit's exposed on the outside of the canopy, and you'll notice the shoulders sort of get brown and don't look good. That's sunburn. So high temperatures can be a problem. And then when you move into central Florida, you still have a chance of a late frost if you kill the flowers or kill the young set fruit, things like that. And so, one of the things that has been happening as the climate has been warming, there are fewer freezing events in central Florida, generally of less duration. So instead of 3 nights in a row for 5 to 12 hours a night, it might be 1 night for 3 hours or something like that. So it's decreasing. So the number of freezing events is decreasing from historically, let's say in the 80s, it was 8 or 9, down to 2 or 3 or less, depending on where you are. And the reason I bring that up is because there's a lot more mango planting happening in Central Florida now. There's a lot of interest, and there's a lot more plantings going in, and also a lot more dooryard planting going in as well. So, this talks about sensitivity to winds, moderately intolerant. So that just means if you're in a windy location, this can make it hard for the young trees to get established, to grow off well, right? So they do better with a little bit wind protection. They are moderately tolerant to periodic, every once in a great while, flooding. Young trees are more susceptible to being killed if they stay wet than older trees. But even the older trees, you might even see them growing along a canal or this and that. Number one, the water in the canal is moving. It's oxygenated. Whereas if it's stagnant water, that becomes a problem. So the other thing, too, is we see some people overwatering their mango trees, especially the mature trees, which you don't want to do. Salinity, so things like sodium and chloride, they are basically not tolerant of sodium or chloride. So one thing to just caution, and we'll talk a little bit about this with the fertilizer, is some of the fertilizers that are in the, what do you want to say, the garden stores, the source of potassium is potassium chloride. Well, chloride is toxic to mango trees. So you want to buy a fertilizer that has a different source of potassium, like potassium sulfate, something like that. They are drought tolerant, especially mature trees. Young trees, not so much. Mature trees are drought tolerant. The trees that we have at the research center, so I'm located at the University of Florida's Tropical Research and Education Center in Homestead, and we have a 160-acre working farm. And I've got about 11 acres of mangoes growing there. And the older trees, so most of my trees, well, I didn't say, yeah, most of my trees are over 10, 15 years old. I don't irrigate them. Mangoes are actually quite drought tolerant. If you over-irrigate them, it's going to reduce the quality of the fruit. You may get internal breakdown, things like that. Young trees, you do want to irrigate. They're less tolerant of dry conditions. Okay. So this is a little bit more of an outline of what I'm going to talk about, and I've already alluded to it. So the climate change, the change in demographics in the U.S., change in mango consumption in the U.S., cultivar diversification, some of the educational events and marketing, mango flowering, pollination, pollinators, and fruit set. This is a big one from homeowners because many times the biggest obstacle people who have mango trees in their home landscape is getting it to set fruit. It'll go ahead and flower, but then it doesn't set fruit. And so we're going to talk about that. And we'll talk about some strategies with fertilizer and tree training and size control, and then synchronizing the canopy of the tree so that the whole tree flowers rather than just parts of it, right? Okay. So these are some of the factors that have enhanced and changed the Florida mango industry going forward. One is the demand for a diversity of superior mangoes with superior aroma and flavors. And obviously, when you look at the collection here and the mangoes that are being sold, there's a lot of enthusiasm for specialty mango varieties you're not going to find in the major grocery stores. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm for that. And how many of you know, so the mangoes you find in the major grocery stores have to be quarantine treated. And I don't know if you know what that means. So when they're imported into the US, prior to being exported, they have to undergo what's called a quarantine treatment. And this is to prevent fruit fly larvae or other insects from being introduced into the US and then causing us a problem. So there's two ways that it's done, either by, I guess I'll call it parboiling the fruit, or by irradiation. And so this is why when you go to the major grocery stores and you pick up a mango, it rarely has much of an aroma. It's because it kills that aroma, basically. Whereas the Florida mangoes, since they're grown here, we don't have to put them in a quarantine treatment. They don't have to be irradiated. So that's why there's a lot more aroma associated with them. Also, as I mentioned briefly, the climate change is enabling the expansion of the mango industry into South Central Florida. And I don't mean just, well, I do mean a few acres, but also hundreds of acres. And also there's been a big promotion of mango consumption like this festival and many other festivals in Florida. And then also marketing strategies have changed, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So over here, this is about the climate. So this is the daily global sea surface temperatures, and why is that important? Because it's really the ocean temperatures that drive the climate. And so you'll see all those gray lines there. Let me see, is this thing gonna, nope. The gray lines and the dark lines, and so the months of the year along the bottom, the temperature, it's in degrees C, but that's basically 68, 72 degrees. And this is the global temperatures. And you'll see the dark lines below, and then you see that red line and the orange line, that was 2024. And you see how high the big difference in the sea surface temperatures. That's huge. Yeah, so that's huge, with time. So all those gray lines are different years. The other one on the right, these are seasonal cycles of temperature variation at the Earth's surface. And it's showing you the cycle, again, the months of the year across the bottom, and of course in the June and July is the highest temperatures, and that's in 1883. And here's 2024, that top red line. So there's been a dramatic increase with that as well. So the trend in Florida, warm night temperatures, if you look at 100 years of temperatures in Florida, the average temperature, daytime temperature, it's not really changed that much over the past 100 years. I mean, we are now, the past 3-4 years, experiencing some extreme summer temperatures during June and July, but it might last for a few weeks here and there, which is unusual. But what has really changed is the nighttime temperatures. And that's what that graph is showing. The warm temperatures above 75 degrees has changed dramatically in the past 30, 40 years. And that's what we're seeing. We're actually having warmer night temperatures. That's the biggest change. Okay, and then if we talk about freezing events, and I alluded to this previously, this is showing from 1892 to 2022, and this is the number of cold days, right? And so you'll see there's a lot of variability all over the place. But in the past 40 years or so, that blue line, the number of freezing events has decreased by about 40%. So there's fewer freezes, the frequency of them happening, and how cold they get and how long they last has decreased. So this is why you're going to see more mangoes being grown in landscapes, in homes, and commercially into central Florida. Also, if we talk about diversification of the US population, there's probably about 40% of the US population now that is familiar with mangoes already. They know what a mango is. This is far different than 40 years ago, 50 years ago. And I was just showing you there, this is the Asian American ethnic groups in millions, and you can see it's very, very diverse. And so these people know about mangoes, they've consumed mangoes all their lives. So again, there's this great interest, and there's a ready-made market for people who want mangoes, especially good quality mangoes. And finally, this is the per capita consumption of fresh mangoes in the US starting in 2000 to 2022. And we went from basically about 1.75 pounds per person to 3.76 pounds per person. And then if you put, somebody like me or some of the other people, it's more like, 15 pounds per person or something, whatever it is. That's probably the first week of mango season. Anyway, but it's increasing. So that's another reason why you see the mango industry changing and a lot of enthusiasm for it. So what we want to do, taking advantage, so the advantages of our local mangoes and mango industry, superior freshness and quality, the wonderful diversity of flavors and colors and aromas, the relatively long season, April, May through September, that we don't have to do these quarantine treatments, as I mentioned, and also that it supports local agriculture and family farms. So these are some of the common mangoes in the international trade in the Western Hemisphere I'm talking about, right? And Florida has a long, long history. I'm talking about over 100 years of introducing mango seeds and mango varieties from other countries and other places. And it also has a long history of selecting mangoes and then promoting those varieties and actually growing them commercially. And the three major varieties that are actually in the Western Hemisphere international trade are those three: Tommy Atkins, Kent, and Kit. There's also some Hayden and some of these other is grown on a smaller scale, but those are the three main ones. These are all, those top three, all Florida varieties, selected in Florida many, many years ago. Okay, and then what's happening now is you're seeing a revival of some of the quote-unquote old-time varieties that are excellent. Glen is an excellent variety, Nam Doc Mai, Southern Blush, Cogsall. So these varieties are now being grown and sold in Florida. So the Florida industry is not interested in trying to compete with offshore mango production that is literally hundreds of thousands of acres. There's no way we can compete with that, or with their price of mangoes, because they don't have the same issues that we have here. But these are some of the varieties that the mango producers here in Florida are now growing and selling. 25, 30 years ago, we were growing those other varieties, the Tommy, the Kit, and the Kent. We were growing those commercially here. We're really not doing, we're doing Kent still some because it's an excellent mango, but those others not so much. And then there's been some significant turnaround, significant events. Gary Zill, who is from Zill High Performance Nursery, has had a breeding program for mangoes in Florida for over 30 years. And that's just a montage of a few of the varieties that he has released. And so they've got, new flavors, superior flavors, interesting colors. Some of them stay green, but the inside is just absolutely fantastic. And so we're seeing these new varieties being grown and sold throughout Florida. This is just a picture of a number of them. He actually has released probably 40, 44 varieties. And these are, okay, is this on? Testing, okay. And so these are now being grown and sold commercially in Florida, and actually sold to people outside of Florida. So some of the educational and promotional events, you obviously know about Fairchild's event. There's also a mango festival that was held in West Palm Beach a couple of weeks ago. Pine Island also has an event, and that was July 12th. And then Mango Mania at the Fruit and Spice Park in Homestead. And there's other events as well. These aren't the only ones. So there are a lot of mango events that are educational and promotional that go on in Florida. Also, online marketing. So we have direct marketing, fruit stands, very popular, people selling to high-end stores, fruit stands from their farm, if you want my mangoes, you're gonna have to come to my farm to pick them up. I know of a grower that's got 25 acres on the West Coast. He sells his mangoes in two ways. One is you have to come to his farm to pick up the mangoes. The other is online. So it used to be mail order, now it's online order. And that's very common now. And also diverse sales. So these are different companies that are doing a lot of direct marketing and online marketing of mangoes. So people all over the country, there's only one state that, well, sometimes two, it varies, but generally the only state that we can't ship mangoes to, fresh mangoes, is California. And that's because they don't want to get any insect that we may have that they don't have. But other than that, we go to the other, 48 states. Okay, so conclusion with this, before we get back into producing mangoes, is Cultivar. So we have Cultivar collections, evaluations, development, and selection, the production of a diverse mango cultivars and selections, and we see established producers and entrepreneurs see a business opportunity. Now, one of the great things about being in Florida is the number of mango collections. So Fairchild has a significant collection. USDA in Miami has a significant collection. Fruit and Spice Park has a significant collection, and the University of Florida Trek has a significant collection. So there's a lot of different mango varieties here in South Florida. Also, the promotion and education. I already mentioned the increased ethnic diversification of the U.S. population, the increased availability of mangoes in the market, multimedia outreach, and the information and dissemination of information, and the ease of purchasing either in person or online. All these have converged to enhance, and that's why you see the acreage of mangoes in Florida increasing because of all those opportunities. So let's talk a little bit about flowering. So there's a tree in full bloom. That's what a panicle looks like. Mangoes have two types of flowers. The bottom two is showing a picture of bisexual flowers. The one on the right is just male flowers. So the bisexual flowers have, obviously, both male and female parts that work. The male flowers only have the male part of the flower that works. So when you see those hundreds or even thousands of flowers on that panicle, some of them are female, some of them are male, okay? So what are the flower-inducing conditions? One is a healthy tree. If your tree's not healthy, it's not going to flower and fruit very well, right? Really important is the canopy being exposed to full sunlight. I'm sure you have all seen big mango trees or even small ones. One side of the tree has flowered and has fruit. The other side of the tree doesn't have any because it's being shaded by a neighboring tree or a building. And that's because in order for the mango to bloom, the stems have to be exposed to full sunlight. If they're not exposed to sufficient sunlight, they may not drop the leaves or drop the stems, but they may not, and they may even flower, but they're not going to set the fruit. So full canopy exposure to sunlight is really key, whether you're growing them commercially or in the home landscape, right? So that we'll talk a little bit about tree size control, and that's where that becomes really important. So what happens, during the winter here in Florida, historically, it's been cool temperatures and then our dry conditions in the past during the winter where it would cause the tree to go dormant. And you want the tree to go dormant for anywhere from 3 weeks to 2 or 3 months if possible. And the varieties vary in how long they need to be dormant before they can flower really well. Something like Edwards, you're looking at 3 weeks where it's not growing, and then if it gets warm and it gets some water, it'll flower. Something like Kit, you're looking at 2 months, maybe more, before it can flower well after being dormant. So, just to caution, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, is one thing you want to really pay attention to is your fertilization and especially nitrogen. Nitrogen is an element that basically tells the tree to grow. Doesn't say what kind of growth, it just says grow. And if you apply too much nitrogen, the tree is going to have a tendency to grow leaves and new shoots and not flowers. And the tree may not go dormant. So you need to pay attention to your nitrogen applications and avoid them. Okay, so now we're going to talk about conditions during flowering, right? So the base temperature for the trees in order to kick off flowering is about 55 degrees. So if it's colder than 55, the tree's not going to start to show the panicles. It's not going to start to flower. And then I mentioned already about it has two types of flowers, male and bisexual. And the proportion of those flowers on a panicle that are bisexual and male varies. It varies by the variety, but it also varies from year to year because of the environmental conditions. And then also, we can have some problems. If we have temperatures let's say below 54 or above 110, this can result in killing the ovule on the female flower parts. And then you're not going to get any fruit set, right? And then if we have temperatures, let's say below, let's say 48 degrees during flowering, this can affect the viability of the pollen. And that again affects the fruit set. And then also excessive temperatures above 90 can also damage the pollen and then again affects fruit set. So you can see why I was telling you those optimum temperatures, 75 to 86 or so is like the sweet spot. Whereas if it gets too hot or too cold, this past year we had cool temperatures during the bloom. And so it wasn't, in general, wasn't enough to kill the female flower parts, but it was enough that it delayed the flowering and the expression of the flowering, and we ended up with actually at least two separate flowerings this year. Because it got cold, it started to flower, got cold, sort of went dormant, then it got warm again, and it sent out new panicles. Okay, and this is just to show you, this is what that chilling temperatures are, so it doesn't have to be freezing. So these are fruit that were set when it was too cold, and it looks like you have fruit set. But when you open up the fruit, and that's only about the size of a golf ball, when you open up the fruit and you look at the embryo, it's dead. So that fruit's going to drop off. It's not going to develop. But it looks like it is, and then all of a sudden you're wondering, why is it all over the ground? It's because it was too cold during that bloom. Okay, so just a little bit more about this flowering. So you know the panicles can be small, up 18 inches, maybe even 24 inches long. This is more of a close-up of the flowers. And they don't all open at the same time, the flowers, right? And I think you probably know that if you've looked at your tree. So just more detail. So the female plant parts, so it's the stigma at the top, the style, which is that tube leading down to the ovary. That's the female parts. The blue line shows you the stamen, and with bisexual flowers, there's generally only one stamen, one. There may be some others there, but they don't work, but just one of them works. And then you have the floral disc, and that's also where the nectary disc is, where there's nectar, okay? So generally, the flowering and the release of pollen happens in the morning. That's when, let's say there's 1,000 flowers. If there's going to be some flowers open that day, let's say 150 flowers, they generally open in the morning. Now that stigmatic surface is generally sticky. So when the pollen lands on it, it sticks to, the pollen sticks to the stigma, right? And it can last up to 72 hours. But from the time the stigma gets pollinized to the time that the egg in the ovary gets fertilized can take up to 5 days. Sort of a slow process. And generally results in 1 to maybe 15 fruit on a panicle. So again, here's the bisexual flower at the top. This is the staminate or the male flower on the bottom that just has the anthers, the male part. And so the pollination is when pollen is transported to the stigma of the female. All right? And remember, I told you it took, and then fertilization, you have to have fertilization. You can't just have pollination. You have to have fertilization in order to have fruit. If you have just pollination, you may not, so let's say it's pollinated, and then we get cold. Well, that pollen grain sends down a tube down to the ovary, right? And you saw it takes, 3 to 5 days, right? But if it's cold for 7 days, that pollen tube can't grow. And it sort of has a battery in it, and if it takes too long to get to the bottom, it runs out of energy and it doesn't make it. And there's actually pictures where they've seen the stigma, and there's let's say 10 pollen grains on there, and they can see 9 out of the 10 never made it to the ovary. And then you'll see one that did make it to the ovary. And then it's fertilized. There, now it's fertilized. We're gonna have a fruit there, okay? That's a pollen grain. Of course, they're not that big, but that's just to show you the pollen grain of mango. So another thing, and I know this is probably making you wonder, how do we ever get fruit on a mango tree because of all these temperature effects and all this? But there's another thing that you want to consider is some mango trees, they can set their own fruit. So the pollen from, let's say, a little gem tree can pollinate itself and you'll have fruit. But there's some varieties that need to have pollen from another variety in order to set fruit. So an example would be Edwards. Edwards is a great fruit. Problem is, it's not what we call self-compatible. So you have to have pollen from another variety of mango in order for it to set fruit. So Edwards, if you have it just in your yard by itself, there's no other mango trees around, you know, you get like one fruit on a 15-foot tree. You know, it's time to get the chainsaw out. So, if it has other trees around, it'll probably set some fruit. Okay. So the varieties do vary in their ability to self-pollinate. So generally, if you have 100 fruit on a tree, part of the fruit are due to cross-pollination and part are due to self-pollination. And if the tree has to make a choice about which fruit is going to end up allowing you to harvest it, it's the ones that have been cross-pollinated that survive, more than the self-pollinated. It's probably much more than you ever wanted to know about it. But anyway, so pollinators. So these are the insects that do the pollination. They're affected by temperatures, rainfall. So if it's flowering and it's raining, this disrupts the process of pollination. The insects aren't flying. And if the raindrops are hitting pollen grains, the pollen grains will absorb that water and burst. So it's killing the pollen grains. So also, what kind of habitat you have around you, native or exotic. Other insects can affect the pollinators, right? And then, of course, your cultural practices, you know, insecticides, fungicides, herbicides, if you're using those, can affect the pollinators. So, talk a little bit about pollinators. When you read the literature, it talks about flying insects. And so we had a graduate student monitor 3 mango groves over an entire flowering season. And we had him collect the insects in his monitoring and then identify what those insects were to try to figure out what is actually pollinating these mango trees. Okay. So he found some honeybees, but out of the 4,500 insects he collected, only 12 were honeybees. There's no way 12 honeybees was responsible for the pollination of 3 mango groves, right? But what he did find were tons of what they call grass flies. Over half the samples were these solitary flies that are everywhere. These are, you know, just native insects, native flies that are out in the environment. Also, blowflies, biting midges, vinegar flies, house flies as well. These are the insects. A lot of fly species are responsible for the pollination of mangoes. Also, hoverflies. And he actually found some ants as well that were carrying pollen. Sometimes, though, they're a pest because they'll move scales and other insects around, but they did find some ants. The most abundant insects they found were these thrips. And what's interesting about them is at a low population of these thrips, they can help with some of the pollination. At a high population, though, they will feed on those flowers and cause the flowers to drop. So it depends on how big the population is, whether they're beneficial or not. Point is, it's not honeybees mainly that is pollinating your mango trees, right? So if you have mango trees and you see a whole lot of different insects other than honeybees, although you do see honeybees, and somebody, I've had this happen where somebody says, oh, I've got all these insects all over the mangoes while they're flowering. I don't see the honeybees, and so I'm spraying the mango tree to kill those insects. Well, you're killing the insects that are pollinating the mango tree. So one of the things we found, and researchers, others, not just us, is that if they have natural areas in their landscape or commercially, if they leave a little section open where the native plants can live and thrive, that's a habitat for all these natural pollinators, these flies and other insects. And that they found that the fruit set and the production was significantly higher in those groves where they had a place for the natural pollinators, and they had natural pollinators and honeybees. They found greater production than if they just had honeybees or they just had the native pollinators. So, you might think about preserving a little bit. It can be like 10 by 10. It can be 2 feet by 5 feet long, where you're allowing the native, we call them weeds usually, grow and thrive, and you'll see the native insects live there. And you want to avoid insecticide use prior to and during flowering. And so it's enhancing the pollinators that can pollinate your trees. This is at the research center. So after harvest, we allow the weeds and the grass to grow in the grove. And we don't mow that or control those weeds until after fruit set the following year. So we're going to go in, we're going to finish harvesting, stop mowing, let this grow, and then come next year after the trees have set the fruit, then we'll go ahead and mow. So just a little bit about nutrition. So not all trees need fertile soil. In fact, mango trees and some others that you want to be able to control the growth of the tree to some extent, it's better not to have really fertile soil, because if it's really fertile, the tree just wants to grow. And we don't want them to just keep growing. So we don't recommend amending the soil with compost or topsoil prior to planting. We want to avoid nitrogen. Remember I was telling you, nitrogen is a nutrient that says grow. So you want to avoid that. We have found that potassium fertilizer is beneficial for flowering and fruit set and fruit size. So we're recommending, maybe one application in October and November and another one in April and May. That's it. So your secondary micronutrients or elements, they can be applied on an as-needed basis or sprayed onto the tree. For young trees, the application of compost and mulch is fine, but you don't want it too deep. You don't want it up against the trunk. But once the tree starts to produce in year 4, 5, 6, you don't want to be adding a lot of compost and mulch. Why? Because you're keeping the ground wet, and the tree's not going to slow down and stop growing during the winter. Right? Remember I told you want it to stop growing during the winter. So, fruit production strategy. For young trees that you've just planted, you want to do a tree training program to make the trees branch. And put it this way, so if you buy one of the mango trees out here and it's only got that one branch, that one shoot, the one stem coming off the trunk, the potential number of fruit you're going to get is 1. If you make the tree branch, you keep pinching it so it branches, and let's say, at the end of a year it's got 15 terminals. Well, that's potentially 15 fruit. You see what I mean? The other thing too is you want to try to maintain the tree canopy in full sunlight exposure for the best production. We'll talk a little bit more about synchronizing all the shoots so that they all behave the same way. Many of you seen, and I'm sure you see when you drive around Miami, you see these big old mango trees, and part of the tree has fruit, part of it has flowers, part of it is sending out new shoots and leaves, and part of it is dormant. Well, that tree is not synchronized. So if only out of 100 shoots, if only 20 are dormant during the winter, you're only going to have 20 of those shoots potentially have fruit, because the others are all doing whatever they want, right? They're all on a different page. They're all like independent contractors. They're just doing whatever they want. So you want to time, your nutritionals and the water and maintain that. For young trees, for the first 3 years or so, you want to irrigate the tree. You want the tree to grow for the first 3-4 years. But after the 3rd year, you want that tree to start flowering and fruiting. So you stop with the NPK, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, right? You stop watering it all the time because now you want it to go into fruit production, which is different than just trying to grow a young tree. So improving production, training the trees. And so here you see a tree, it's just basically one shoot, and then you cut that off at about 3 feet, and you'll see it branch, right? And the first 2 years, you want to do this to the tree during the growing season so that you're going to increase the branching. So here it is. I just got the tree, I cut it, now it's got like 5 branches. I tip it again. So what happens is it sends out a shoot and then rests for a little bit and then sends out another shoot. When it stops with that second flush of shoot, that's where you cut that again. And now it's going to branch again. And you just keep doing that the first couple of years, and you'll get a much more complex tree. This is what you want on the right-hand side. Yeah, year 2, year 3, that's what you want. Okay? And there's some publications. There's also videos online. I know Richard Campbell has some videos on it. Jeff Wasilewski has some videos on it. So there's information on the steps on just pruning the tree to make it a complex tree, to get it to flower and fruit and have more fruit. And this is after, this is year 1, year 2, and year 3. So you see how it 1 or 2 flushes and then you cut it again. And then by the end of year 3, you could go ahead and stop the tip pruning, done in early September, would be the last time. This will stimulate the tree to go ahead and put out 1 more flush. And don't irrigate and fertilize it. Hopefully, it'll flower that next spring, right? Because now it's big enough to hold some fruit. And this is just talking about a larger tree where you're going to open up the tree, remove those shoots that are going straight up. And this is done after harvest. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about tree size control. So now I'm talking about larger trees. I'm not talking about young trees, right? So the idea is to maintain fruit production all along the sides of the tree, not just the tops of the tree. And you guys probably have noticed these big old trees, they'll have most of their fruit up in the top. Well, that's where most of the sunlight is. The other thing that happens is that if you let a tree keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, the top limbs and shoots shade the bottom limbs and shoots. And if they don't have enough exposure to sunlight, those leaves drop off, those shoots die, and then those limbs die because they're not exposed to sun. And then your first fruit is at about 9 feet, which is not great. So the idea is to have the tree exposed to sunlight all around the canopy to maintain that lower canopy. I would rather pick the fruit basically from the ground, let's say to 12 feet, than have my first fruit at 9 feet. But you have to prune to do that. And it also improves the light around the tree, on the bottom of the tree especially, but also air movement. And you want the tree canopy to dry out really quickly, especially after rainfall, right? If the tree stays wet, then there's more disease on the flowers and the fruit. So you want to have that tree dry out. The only way to do that is to open it up to some light and air movement. It also makes it easier if you are going to try to do some disease or insect control. And it's also easier to pick from the ground, standing or maybe with a picking pole, not climbing a ladder, and trying to reach that last fruit and then you fall off the ladder. It also, the other key thing it does is it reduces the chances of the tree falling over in a hurricane. You know what I mean? So that's another big one. And so some of the low vigor varieties like, Fairchild and Pickering, some of those varieties easily keep that tree over its lifetime at 10 feet or less. If you have the more moderate varieties, Angie, something like that, it should be kept at 12 feet or less. And even if you have a high vigor tree, it should be kept at 15 feet or less. And so I'm not really, with the trees that I have, I don't really care, I try to keep the trees in my collection at 15 feet or less. It's not always easy, but that's what we try to do, because it's much easier to do everything to them and much easier to harvest and much less of a chance of the tree falling over or being toppled over or actually pulled out of the ground during a hurricane. And we learned that painful lesson in 1992 with Hurricane Andrew, and we did a big survey after that. It was Dr. Bellardi and Richard Campbell and myself. We looked at thousands of acres, and we found out, how big were the trees before the storm and what happened to the trees after the storm. And it was clear. If your trees were much above 15 feet, the chances of them being pushed over was significantly greater. Anyway, so the other thing is thinning out some of the limbs, the large limbs. You can do that by hand in the dooryard trees easily. Continue to favor the horizontal limbs. So there's just a process of pruning your trees annually. And this is just showing you a thinning out cut. So you'll see it's just removing some of these inner limbs, especially if they're going straight up. So what if you have a really big tree that's never been pruned? Okay. First thing, first you need to decide, what to do. There are different county regulations. Some counties, there's a lot of regulations on what you can prune and how drastically you can prune them. Other counties, not so much. So you need to, in some counties, you need a permit to do drastic pruning. So you need to think about that before somebody knocks on your door because you've pruned your tree. But some of those really big trees, I don't recommend that the homeowner try to bring those trees down. You might also, if you're going to hire somebody to do it, make sure they are licensed and they have insurance. Because if they get hurt or killed, they're going to come after you, and then you'll be pruning their tree. Because it's, you have to be make sure they're licensed and insured. And, if you have somebody professionally do it, they can make it where the wind doesn't push it over, the wind goes through it, it's a safer tree. The other thing you want to consider too is maybe actually taking the tree out and starting over. So improving the fruit production, and I want to talk, this will be the last thing I'm going to talk about. And so you see that tree in the top where the whole tree is flowering. That's a synchronized tree. That tree is synchronous. The whole tree is flowering. So I have potential for fruit on that whole tree. Sorry, that second photo is not really clear, but you see the reddish color there. That's part of the tree is dormant, and part of the tree has new leaves. So it's not synchronized, because part of the tree has new leaves, part of the tree is dormant. And then you look at this asynchronous tree on the bottom, and you'll see it did set fruit along the bottom part of the tree, but the top part of the tree, there's no fruit. Those shoots were on a different page during the winter and during the spring. Okay? And this is typical of what happens to trees that aren't pruned. Parts of the tree tend to act on their own differently. As I said, some of the tree will be dormant, some will have flowers, some will be starting to push new leaves. So, easiest thing to do is if you prune your tree annually, whether it's in the landscape by hand, is by being sure that you prune as many of the shoots at the same time. This resets the clock, and all the new shoots that come from that pruning, right? You prune it, and then the buds sprout from below it are going to be on the same page. They're going to be synchronized.
Thank you for the lecture. So you talked about pruning. So right after I prune my tree, I get like 7 or 8 little things that come out. How soon can I cut those?
So, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, so you cut that you pruned, and now those new shoots come out, and it's gonna flush, right, and then stop for a little while, and then it's gonna flush again, and it's that second one you want to tip. Yeah, the one you can remove those if there's like 7 of them coming out and you only really want 3 or 4, you can remove those others at the base. Yeah. Yeah, sooner is better than later because it's less of less damage, right? It's less of a wound. Yeah, sure.
How about spacing when it comes, because you recommend the maximum to be 15. How about spacing and also spacing from the fence? In my case, I have a wall. So I know that I needed to separate it.
Yeah.
What would you say between trees and from the wall?
Yeah, you really need to be, see, Edward can be a big tree. So I would suggest getting one of the more dwarfing types. You could have 3 dwarfing types for that one Edward and be fine. And you could, Yeah, so you need to be, let me put it this way, eventually the tree is gonna go over the fence or over the wall, if you let it. I don't know how tall the wall is, but 8 feet, Yeah, so you wanna, the tree needs to be probably 15 feet from the wall, 15 feet from other trees, 15 feet from other structures, and definitely stay away from high electrical wires, right? All that kind of stuff. And you've, of course, called to make sure that they came and marked where the wires and the plumbing and all that is before you dig. You need to, like before you dig in your yard, especially in that urban landscape, you're gonna wanna call 311 and say, hey, I need to have somebody come out and mark the wires, mark the cable, mark the plumbing lines, because if you break them, you gotta pay for them. Yeah, you don't wanna do that. Yeah, and you don't wanna plant over the septic tank if you have a septic tank. Yeah. Okay.
All right, everybody. Give it up for Dr. Crane. Thank you so much. That was amazing.